so easy for humans sometimes, I think, just psychologically to think, oh, that environment's big and we are small and nothing we're gonna do is gonna hurt it, so we don't need to think about it. But we've learned that lesson so many times over here on Earth that actually we are capable of filling up landfills and depleting rivers and reservoirs and, significantly changing our atmosphere. And so having learned that lesson here on Earth, we need to recognize the same thing could happen in space. Just because space is infinite doesn't mean the parts of it that we can reach are infinite or immune to our change. Plus, space is weird in that it doesn't have ecosystems and weather and water that will sort of heal any of the scars we cause on it. And so anything we do out there is going to permanently change it, whether for the good or the bad, however we interpret that, which I think just requires us ethically and just in terms of common sense to take a moment and say, is this the right choice? Is this what we want to do as a species? Is this going to benefit everyone? Should we?
So this is a very special episode of The Outside Context for us, and we'll get a little bit more into that. Today, to celebrate this special episode, I am wearing my Outside Context sweater that Elise had printed for us. But let's get straight into it. Elise, what's your outside context moment for this week?
So, I'm very excited about this episode as well for a number of reasons. First of which being, we recorded with our special guest on my birthday, so that was quite fun. I was like with family and friends, but also the reason this guest was so special was because she was one of the people that actually inspired us to start the Outside Context. So, her name is Erika, and about a year ago, I read her book, which was about the ethics of space exploration. And I remember texting Jana being like, I just read the coolest book, and Jana's on holiday, and I'm bothering her on WhatsApp saying, I just read the coolest book. You have to read it right now. And so it was such a full circle moment to then have her as our special guest on the episode of The Outside Context, and on my birthday, no less. But we will get into that later. My actual outside context moment for this week was that also for my birthday, I received, I don't know if you guys can see it, probably not, but I received a ring from my partner that was an Ouroboros. And I'm sure most people have kind of heard of the symbol before, but it's the snake biting its own tail. And it represents the kind of eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. But my outside context moment about this was because since I got the ring and I think the symbol is really cool, I was like looking into it a bit more and I was like reading. And while its earliest use and the earliest known use of the motif was in ancient Egypt, it's actually in the tomb of King Tut, Tutankhamun, for those of us not on a short name basis with him. And so the first known use was in King Tut's tomb, but actually it appears elsewhere across not only like ancient Egypt's history, but in many other cultures as well, including Norse mythology. So one of the three children of Loki, it was also the symbol there, and many others as well in kind of Indian thought, and then later in psychology as well as alchemy. And so what got me thinking was, yes, and the Ouroboros is not unique in this. There are many symbols and motifs that appear in a kind of cross-cultural way around the world throughout history, but across cultures that didn't have contact with each other at that time, or known contact at least. And I guess in our hyper-connected world, but if we think far into the future, I'm wondering what those symbols will be then. So, like, what are going to be our lasting symbols that we're creating now that actually go the distance and last, thousands of years in the future? And I guess, who knows? But I'm curious as to what they will be. And I really like the Ouroboros. I hope that one continues. So that was my outside context moment for the week. What was yours?
Oh, I want to go back to yours, first of all. So, what do you think some of those symbols might be, those enduring symbols?
So
I mean, they
here's
could be road signs for all we know. Road signs are pretty universal. Like 2,000 years in the future, the yield sign could be, a global symbol of some sort.
Or like for example, like something as boring or like day to day as like a street light or a lamp post. Like, like think about like the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when like the lamp post gets taken and like put into Narnia, and then it becomes this object of cultural significance. Sometimes we don't always choose the objects that carried on, and they're not always something, so crazy, and then later meaning can be ascribed to them. So I agree. I actually think it's likely to be something like maybe kind of boring, or maybe it's like a cell phone, like literally just like what is this like cube that's in like all of the pictures from this era or something like that.
A highly stylized apple with a bite taken out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
So my outside context moments is along the same lines in terms of how how our symbolism evolves over time. So there's an asteroid that has a between 1% and 2.3%. I think it's increased slightly. A while ago, it had a 1.3% chance of hitting the Earth. In December 2032, it's now up to 2.3%. It's still a very low chance, high probability that it's going to pass by without incident. Um, but this got me thinking because I was, I remember in the late 90s, there was a spate of movies, disaster movies about asteroids hitting the Earth. I think there was Armageddon and Deep Impact, for example. Asteroids, the asteroid apocalypse seemed to be a big theme at the time. And we were also confronted as well with the millennium bug and that potential apocalypse, although that didn't seem to have made its way into our cinematic culture in quite the same impactful way as asteroids did. But it made me think about the apocalypse over time. And I think, you know, since the early days of humanity, we've probably had some view of some catastrophic world-ending event, whether it's by, you know, by the hand of a malevolent god or deity, or whether it's through, you know, human recklessness and hubris. There's some idea, or you know, whether it's just through sheer chance and, you know, our insignificance in the universe, like the asteroids. But there's this idea that one day the world will end, there will be a catastrophic event, and that the nature of that event has sort of evolved over time. So we had, you know, in biblical times, we had the biblical apocalypse, which was a very precisely defined thing. We moved on to the nuclear apocalypse, which was big in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, possibly enjoying a little bit of a resurgence now, I think, as you know, we're the closest on the doomsday clock we've ever been to human annihilation. Um, we had the asteroids. We had the climate apocalypse scenarios. For some reason, in the early noughties, it was all about the zombie apocalypse.
And then that resurfaced in COVID. Remember, there were all of those like kind of spooky rumors, like things going around the internet, like saying like the people that had died from COVID were coming back as zombies. No, just my corner of the internet. Don't know if you saw that.
Possibly, I kind of missed that. I think there was, again, probably in the mid noughties, more of a, you know, virus apocalypse that
Mm.
maybe was
There were a
a
lot of
slightly
good
more,
films about
yeah.
that.
But what is our apocalypse now? No
Tech
pun intended.
apocalypse. It's the
True.
AI apocalypse. Like, I think that we're gonna see more. You know how also kind of early 2000s we had like iRobot, there were like some Ex Machina. I think we're gonna have like more of like tech apocalypse movies and like tech apocalypse fears, especially as AI grows. And like they'll be able to make better, more accurate scenarios of what that would look like. Not that people haven't been talking about this for a really long time. I mean, Isaac Asimov was obviously on it. Um, so
And let's not forget as well, the mother, or shall we say daddy, of all the tech apocalypses, which is really the Terminator movie series. Again,
Alex will be
enjoying
very
a little
happy you
bit of a
mentioned those.
revival right now. Yeah.
Definitely, definitely. But I mean, I'll be interested to know what our listeners think. What is the next apocalypse going to be?
So on that note, onwards and upwards, and let's get talking to Erica.
I'm excited for this one. Let's go.
Hi, Erica. It's great to have you here with us today. We're so excited about this episode. As you know, you were our original inspiration. Your book, Off Earth, was our original inspiration for this podcast. So, to start off, Can you tell us a little bit about your journey from astrophysics to space ethics and to the gaming industry and beyond?
Of course. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to hear that I've been an inspiration. So yeah, I have had a circuitous and interesting and unusual journey, I think. So I started on the pretty standard path of getting my PhD in physics with a specialty in astrophysics. I was very fortunate. I went to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and they sent a lot of us astro grad students right down the road to NASA Goddard. So I had just the amazing opportunity to work at NASA to do my PhD research. I'm a computational astrophysicist, so I wrote computer simulations of space, which is what I do still now. I left academia when I was a postdoc. I was working as a research scientist at the Carnegie Institute, really loved that work, but I took what ended up being a dream job for me with a company that makes one video game called Universe Sandbox, which is just a computer simulation of space, so exactly what I was doing as a scientist, but it's a video game and it lets you interact with orbiting planets. You can smash moons and planets together. It's a lot of fun, and it's gorgeous because of our great graphics team. And it lets me kind of talk about space and reach out to directly to the public instead of just to other scientists, which is something that I enjoy. But along the way, I had this sort of separate but parallel journey when I was working as a postdoc at Carnegie, which was in Washington, D.C. I had the opportunity to participate in a NASA program. It was, I think, a 6-week summer program for graduate students and postdocs out in Silicon Valley, California. It was working on big data problems in planetary defense, so that was a lot of fun. But they introduced us to a lot of people in the private spaceflight industry because it was, I think, partially funded by some private groups. And that was exciting to me because I've been thinking about leaving academia. I've always been really fascinated by human spaceflight. This was in 2016, so asteroid mining was all the rage at the time. But I found I was kind of disappointed with the answers I was getting to a lot of my questions that I was asking these space entrepreneurs about things like, how are you going to protect the lunar surface environment from your mining equipment, or how are you going to protect the labor rights of the people who are working in space? And I just got a lot of very polite but rather dismissive, we'll worry about that later, which I sensed wasn't correct, but I didn't know the answers either. So when I came back, I made a podcast, which, as you know, is a fun way to get fascinating people to talk to you. And I talked to people who would know the answer to these kinds of questions, philosophers and ethicists and sociologists, and policymakers, and people who study colonial history. And that sort of started my journey. I learned more. I met a lot of fascinating people. I ended up writing a book called Off Earth, which was sort of the book version of the podcast. I co-founded a nonprofit. And so I've just been doing that this whole time on the side, and just meeting fascinating people and learning as much as I can, and then passing that on to my readers and listeners.
Well, as Jana said, we're certainly like so excited to have you on. I absolutely love the book, and I highly recommend it to anyone who has an interest, in the space industry. But also I found it like very approachable because you didn't actually have to be an astrophysicist, which anyone who listens to this will know that I am definitely not. You don't have to be an astrophysicist or, the next astronaut to actually understand it. And I think it poses questions that are really kind of relatable for everyone who's thinking about the future of civilization and what it looks like to be multiplanetary. So I guess maybe if you could unpack that a little bit more for us. What do we mean when we say like the ethics of space exploration? Because for previous listeners of the Outside Context, we had a whole episode about space security and the kind of geopolitical elements there. But what do we mean from an ethical perspective, and what were some of those most pressing ethical issues you came across when you were working on the book and the podcast?
Yeah, so most of what my book and my podcast focused on was human space settlement. So this is going to be, beyond our lifetimes, the idea of expanding human civilization into space and creating these hopefully sustainable, permanent communities of humans living in space. And that's a long-term and more speculative, distant goal, which makes it easier to sort of hand wave your way around some of the technical challenges. But the more I learned, the more I realized that a lot of these issues that I was thinking about are issues we're already confronting today in our human exploration of space right now, our use of space, because we already use space now. People, make money with their private businesses in space, and our near-term plans for space. And so there's a whole spectrum of these issues. So I divided my book and my podcast into a few main chunks. There's the questions of how humans will live together in space, live with each other, and that's got all the complexity of the questions of how humans live together here on Earth. So how we organize ourselves, how will we make decisions about laws and governance and things like that. How will we resolve conflicts within our communities and between communities? How will we build communities that can thrive? Will we be able to reproduce in space? How will we make sure that we're fairly distributing medical resources? Things like that. All sorts of fascinating things I could talk to sociologists and things about. But then there's also, more urgently now, I think, the question of how we're going to use the space environment and whether we need to protect that environment and how we'll share our use of that environment. And this is an urgent question now, right in our backyard, in low Earth orbit, which is the nearest part of the space environment that you can consider sort of the boundary between Earth and the environment we're used to thinking about and space. And it's weird to think of it as an environment that needs protection because it's literally empty space, but it's really valuable. We can put so much valuable, useful technology into low Earth orbit, but it's not infinite. We can only cram so many satellites in there before they start colliding with each other and producing debris and breaking down. And so there's a big ongoing debate right now about how we use that space, how we allocate the orbital slots fairly, how we protect the environment from damage through collisions and things like that. I know that you two could probably speak more on this, but I know that regulation has had trouble keeping up with the rapidly growing pace of things like satellite, internet, mega constellations, things like that. And there's a lot of debate about fairness and should countries that don't have a space program yet, should we be preserving some of these orbital slots for them? Or should it just be first come, first serve? And I've heard people say if we can't work out these problems right now in our own backyard, that's not a good sign for our future environmental justice issues farther out in space. So I think those issues in low Earth orbit are really good case studies, and urgent and timely case studies for space ethics.
One thing I found really fascinating about the book was that, of course, we're not actually starting from a blank slate when we're looking at these questions. It has happened and it has been done before. Admittedly, not always in the best way, and that's the history of colonization, basically. And the history of, human civilization on Earth is, I suppose, in itself the history of colonization. Humans have moved from one area to another, from occupied bits of the planet to unoccupied bits of the planet, to different habitats. They've changed those habitats. They've also moved to places where people were already living, and we've seen the consequences of that as well. And they, as they've moved, they've also changed the ecosystems. They've changed the life forms that exist there, and they've had an impact on that. And so, can you tell us a bit more about that, about how that history of colonization and the experiences and lessons that we can learn from that can influence how we approach the colonization of space?
Absolutely. There's actually a bit of a debate about the term space colonization and whether we should be using that word. And it's not really about policing the word. It's about what model we want to use as we go out and have humans living in space. Certainly a lot of space settlement advocates and a lot of science fiction uses parallels with the European colonization of North America in particular, but also just colonization of the rest of the world. Often it's portrayed in a positive light, especially the US has this whole mythology around the European settlement, especially of the western part of the US, and how much opportunity there was and how we built this great country. And it's a very positive way to read it. And so a lot of people have tried to build parallels off of that and say, oh, we should have private companies funding space settlement in the same way that there were private companies funding this colonization of North America, and look at all the technological innovation we got, and look how rapidly we developed and used the country. But of course, there were so many terrible results and consequences and side effects of the colonization of North America. The primary one being the fact that people already lived here. And so the intentional and unintentional genocides that took place here against the indigenous people is the number one thing to think about. I've heard a lot of people say, oh, well, we don't have to worry about that. parallel in space because, as far as we know, there's no indigenous life. But not only does that sort of erase indigenous people from the narrative, and they should be included in discussions of space settlement, but there's that was not the only downside of colonization, right? So the mindset of colonization, that you're coming to this pristine, untouched, uninhabited, in quotes, land, and the resources are just laying around for you to gobble up, and it's almost your duty, manifest destiny, to use these resources and develop and democratize and civilize this country. That mindset is still what some people want us to take into space, and it caused a lot of other consequences, like huge amount of environmental degradation, resource overuse, environmental damage that we're still all dealing with today in the form of climate change and other things. And we could easily carry that same attitude into space and just keep degrading every territory we come across up there. And there's also a lot of labor exploitation that's an inherent part of that colonization model. Not just indigenous people, but all of the other forced labor that European settlers brought in. And that could easily be replicated in space if we don't pay attention and learn from history. It's really easy. Science fiction authors have been doing this a long time. It's really easy to come up with dystopian visions of how we could do this wrong. And it's important to think about those. But when I get too worried and depressed about it, I remember that the thing we have, the advantage that we have at this stage in our history, is that we have all of human history to learn from. So we just need to be deliberate about consulting these historians and looking at our past, trying to find both the cautionary tales and all of the lessons learned about how we can do better. What human societies and cultures have learned to live sustainably in their environments, have learned to protect the rights of marginalized people, protect workers, things like that, and make sure we're bringing the right parallels and the right lessons forward into the future in space.
And I think maybe if we could just like go into that and give people a specific example, because I think that's really interesting. And I know you and Jana and I were speaking previously that you're a massive sci-fi fan as well. And you're right, this labor exploitation point is actually one that happens frequently in sci-fi books. A recent one that I enjoyed lately was the Red Rising series, which I think I mentioned to both of you. And that hugely focuses on kind of, the sequencing out of society and the labor exploitation of the lower levels. But could you give us a really practical example of one of the things that came out from your book, or when you were speaking to these experts on your podcast, of like what that labor exploitation could look like in real life, to like kind of bring it back for people? But also, if you have a favorite sci-fi example, very happy to hear that too.
So in terms of science fiction, Red Rising is something I'm reading through right now, and absolutely there's great examples of labor exploitation in that. The book and television series that I ended up reading, because it kept coming up in my podcast interviews at the time, was The Expanse, which included a group of people who lived and worked in the asteroid belt. They were called belters, and they were just extremely exploited by the rest of society because they had access to these really valuable resources, but they didn't have any power. And were needed to extract those resources. So it's interesting that mining keeps coming up when it comes to labor exploitation. So in The Expanse, in Red Rising, both of the press groups are mining. And we've seen a lot of labor exploitation in mining historically here on Earth. It's that balance between a really dangerous and isolated and remote workplace that needs a lot of physical labor, combined with really valuable resources that make the owners a lot of money, and that seems to set up a really vulnerable situation for the workers. Aside from mining, one example that I ran across when I was doing my podcast, I was talking to a woman named Sarah Newell, who worked at the time for the International Labor Defense Forum. I'm getting that name wrong, but she was a labor rights activist. And she said she had never thought about her work in the context of space before, but once she started thinking about it, because my email had prompted her to think about it, she started getting kind of terrified about it. And she pointed out that one issue is transportation. So she was working on the issue in Thailand. There are the Thai fishing industry. There are migrant workers who come in from other countries. They're very poor. They often can't afford to travel to Thailand, and so they go into debt They take on debt for that travel, and then once they get there, their passports are taken away. They're told, you owe us for shipping you here, so you have to work off that debt. They put them on boats and they send them out to sea for months to years at a time, and they can't get back because they're on a boat. They don't have a way to get back, and they're often, in vulnerable situations. They can have a lot of physical abuse, a lot of danger on those boats because they don't have a way to call for help or to report this, or even just to quit and leave. And Sarah Newell pointed out that you can easily imagine this happening in space. You go into debt to go into space, which is something that's already been proposed for people who can't afford to buy a ticket for Mars, for example. It's been proposed, well, you could just take on the debt and then work off the debt. So you're in debt, you're in a remote, dangerous environment, and you have no way to quit and go home because the rocket trip back to Earth is likely very expensive. And so we could easily just be replicating the same issues that we've seen historically and are still struggling with here today on Earth, just because of the physical environment alone.
And I think that, that ties in nicely as well with the way that space exploration has changed over the last few decades. Because, when space exploration started, it was driven by the public sector. It was driven by governments. The space race, of course, that's a whole other story, and one we explored a bit more in one of our previous episodes. But of course, we've seen this shift from space exploration that's driven by governments and by public interest, and therefore reflect some of the ideals of the societies that are behind those jurisdictions that are leading in space travel, to the private sector, and as a private sector that is driven by tech billionaires, basically, with very different interests, very different goals, and very different ideologies motivating them as well. What's your view on that, and how that's changing the nature of space exploration, and what that means for the future of space exploration?
Yeah, and of course, that's not to say that governments aren't capable of exploiting their workers, but it's really important to me to look at the different motivations for the different groups of people who want to go into space. So when government space agencies want to put humans in space, they're often doing it because it helps their national reputation, or because they're interested on the side about the military and the national posture that they can gain from more space technology. When private companies want to put people into space, it's because they want to make money, because we live in a capitalist system. That's just what motivates them. It doesn't mean that every private company is going to exploit its workers, but that motivation being different from other motivations can make people more vulnerable to exploitation, which means we need to pay more attention to protecting their rights, and that extends to a lot of things. So this capitalist motivation to exploit resources and make a profit, and this duty to your shareholders to continue to do that, often means that we damage the environment through private company activities. We've seen this on Earth. We're seeing it today. It's something we're all struggling with. And again, it's not because necessarily these companies are trying to destroy the environment or they don't care about the environment, but their primary motivation can lead to a lot of environmental degradation. And so, as a society, if we don't want to see that, we need to pay attention and put extra protections into place. And these different conflicting interests are just going to keep getting more in conflict in space now that more and more types of people have access to space. It's not just the governmental agencies trying to win a space race, and it's not just the scientists. The space scientists have been lucky, I think, for most of our existence to have all the room that we want to access the objects of our study. But now we're going to have to start competing with mining companies who want to extract and exploit resources, with tourists who want to stomp all around the place that we're trying to study, and perhaps someday with people who want to settle there. And so space scientists are going to be in the same situation that other types of scientists here on Earth are already in, which is how to navigate those conflicts. And anyone thinking about space ethics, any given space ethics problem, I think it's important to start with, okay, what are the different groups interacting with this problem, the different stakeholders, you might say? What are their different motivations, and how do those motivations determine how they'll answer these questions differently?
And I think that that is so fascinating because it's one thing that for Jana and I, this is what we work on in a day to day in our jobs in the kind of the financial regulation and looking at digital and tech policy. We look at what are the different stakeholders? What do they want to get out of a financial services future? But I think that the difference between what we see in the financial sector and so many other sectors, as Jana and I are learning as we carry on with this podcast, is that the financial sector is much more heavily regulated. And you absolutely see the same thing, a duty to return shareholder value. And that is something like companies have to be profitable in order to survive. And I don't think anyone is advocating that, financial firms should suddenly stop being profitable. However, a lot of the regulation looks at making sure they have good governance, making sure they're caring about things from a sustainability and ethical perspective, making sure that they are treating their workers fairly and giving them pensions and things like that. And I think that we don't see that as much in other sectors. So maybe, if you could talk a bit more about what you've seen and also maybe the work that you do in your own nonprofit, what could a good future of space regulation look like?
That's a great question, and I wish I was a policymaker and could give more specific answers to that questions. But there's a lot of space lawyers and policymakers doing amazing work. It can just be hard to keep up sometimes, as I mentioned, and to just balance again all these competing interests. I think it's important. It's been important for me along this journey to recognize that again, these different motives don't mean that any one group is uniformly good or uniformly evil in the way that they're going to approach space. But it's important to recognize what their interests are and then step back and say, okay, what are the interests of humanity as a whole, the human species? If we all agree that we want to be good people and make sure that we're equitably distributing the benefits of space, if everyone wants to go around saying space should be for the benefit of all mankind, which is in our international treaties and in a lot of our PR, then how do we make sure that that's being kept in mind? And sometimes that means pushing back against the interests of different types of groups. It doesn't mean that those interests are wrong or unethical, but they need to be pushed back against. And that's what policy making and regulation, I think, is for, is to make sure that we're balancing all of this. So that means that, if governments want to go to space and make sure that they have dominance in one, on the moon or on Mars without actually claiming the territory. The US has a lot of great rhetoric about why we want to go to the moon and Mars, and the Artemis Accords are all about, international cooperation, things like that. But also the US wants to be in charge up there, and they don't want someone else like China to be in charge. Okay, that's what governments do. Private companies, they certainly have a lot of rhetoric about humanity's future in space and democratizing space and innovation and technology, but also what they really want is to make money. That's okay. That's what private companies are for. Scientists love to think that we have the purest motives, but our motives are not necessarily the good of all humanity. It's to do our science, to learn more about science. All of those are fine as long as you understand their motives, and as long as we as a society agree that you have to make sure that those particular groups' interests don't end up damaging the interests and choices of humanity as a whole or with other groups. So it's all about balance, and I think I would like to see more cooperation between private space companies and regulators. I think there are some companies saying, hey, we need regulation. We need to be corralled in some ways, if nothing else, to make sure that we're not damaging these environments so badly that we all got out of business. But also just, for more humanitarian and ethical reasons. And I've seen some companies really embrace that. I've seen scientists embrace the idea of working together with these different groups instead of just saying, hey, we're scientists, we should be in charge. And so that's what I'd like to see, is just acknowledging that no one of these groups should be in charge of everything and be correct about, have full access, that we all need to balance our interests. And that regulation isn't necessarily evil. That's the shift I'd like to see.
I feel like Jana and I spend a lot of our time trying to bang that drum to people with regards to financial regulation. So completely understand and agree. And a phrase we use a lot is appropriate and proportionate regulation, but that also supports responsible innovation. And I feel like that's what we need for the space industry too.
Yeah. Space industry, really, a lot of people like to argue, and this is, I think, because it comes from, there's a lot of overlap between the space industry and the tech industry. There's this argument that regulation stifles innovation. And so, yeah, I understand it's a balance. You don't want to have so much regulation that you can't take risks or do interesting things, but completely unregulated innovation has its own bad consequences. So it's just, unfortunately, this is one of those cases where the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do, which is just an ongoing, nuanced, constant conversation and struggle to try to find what's best for everyone, and that work will never end.
And from a legal perspective, it's super challenging, obviously, as well, because you're talking about space here. You're talking about potentially other planets, asteroids, the space in between them, and who has jurisdiction is going to be a massive question. And how is that jurisdiction enforced? And do you have sort of local jurisdictions that you establish, because you could be waiting a long time for a response to come back from Earth the further away you are. And I guess that takes us on to, this question of interplanetary civilization. If, Elon Musk wants us to colonize Mars, for many science fiction authors, the future is in space. You mentioned The Expanse, which I absolutely love, and one of the reasons I love it so much is because the politics of that world are so fully realized, and so much of the nuance and the detail of what happens in the space environment feeds into that kind of political vision. Like the Belters you mentioned, one of the reasons they are powerless is because they are they've been genetically engineered, and they've also evolved slightly to adapt to life in a low gravity environment, and they physically cannot go down to a planet, so they're trapped in this artificial environment, because obviously you can't terraform an asteroid. And so therefore they are literally a captive labor force in that respect, which again drives their political position. But if we are going to start becoming an interplanetary species, if we're going to start, to set up establishments, I'm not going to use the word colonize, on other bodies, whether they're asteroids or planets, obviously there's lots to consider. There's not just local, there's not just the local laws that will need to be in place and how they're enforced and things like that, but there's also, what right we have to do that, what precautions we need to take to to understand whether or not there is existing life, even if it's single-celled life, and what duty of care we have to it, or even on an uninhabited planet or rock, what duty of care do we have to preserve that environment? So how are some of these ways that we can start thinking responsibly about becoming an interplanetary civilization?
There's so much we can learn from environmental ethicists and environmental activists here on Earth about a lot of these things. Environmental ethics has this concept of the precautionary principle, which, the way I clumsily phrase it, is the idea that it's best to just take a step back, take a breath, and actually think about what we're doing in space before we go out and do it, because anything we do to the space environment is going to be a permanent change. So easy for humans sometimes, I think, just psychologically, to think, oh, that environment's big and we are small, and nothing we're going to do is going to hurt it, so we don't need to think about it. But we've learned that lesson so many times over here on Earth, that actually we are capable of filling up landfills and depleting rivers and reservoirs and, significantly changing our atmosphere. And so, having learned that lesson here on Earth, we need to recognize the same thing could happen in space. Just because space is infinite doesn't mean the parts of it that we can reach are infinite or immune to our change. Plus, space is weird in that it doesn't have ecosystems and weather and water that will sort of heal any of the scars we cause on it. And so anything we do out there is going to permanently change it, whether for the good or the bad, however we interpret that, which I think just requires us ethically, and just in terms of common sense, to take a moment and say, is this the right choice? Is this what we want to do as a species? Is this going to benefit everyone? Should we be taking any precautions, like putting regulations into place, or preserving certain areas, things like that? And that goes for both just general environmental protection. It goes for this question of planetary protection, which is our term for making sure we don't contaminate space environments that might have life in them. If we do find microbial life somewhere, there's going to be a huge debate about whether we should stop using that environment in order to preserve the life or not, or whether it's just microbes, humans should do what they want there. I know there's going to be a huge debate because there already is a huge debate, and it's still hypothetical. And yeah, even in lifeless environments that we could somehow prove are lifeless, there's also debate even among philosophers. I've heard philosophers debate amongst themselves about what's the value of a lifeless environment. Should we be preserving it? Does it have some sort of intrinsic right to exist as it is without our interference? And both sides have been argued. There different cultures approach the answer to that different ways. It's hard for us to even answer that from Earth environmental ethics because there's no lifeless environments on Earth. So it's sort of a new question for us. But all of these things need to be thought about before we just blunder out there and do something, and then we realize we've permanently changed something and it's too late. It's too late.
And
we don't have our choices anymore.
And I think as well, you mentioned it earlier as well, is it's about those continued conversations and conversations between the public and private sector and scientists and civilians who will be eventually going up there as well. And all of these various stakeholder groups should be included in that dialogue. But this has been so much fun, and I'm really excited to continue to recommend your book to everyone because I love it so much. But if you could, maybe last question, tell us some of your favorite sci-fi books and shows that can kind of maybe inspire people to keep thinking about these questions and like why they're your favorite in the context of, ethical space exploration and potential, multiplanetary futures.
So sometimes I struggle with this question because most of my favorite science fiction is actually about alien life and SETI and First Contact and things like that, which is not quite
That's fine. Include that too. I mean, that's a whole other, maybe we'll do a part 2 of this episode on First Contact. So feel free to include that too.
But I think, I have done the work because I've been asked this before of thinking about, well, what can we actually, which science fiction stories are the best for thinking about these space settlement issues and even today's issues? Certainly what got me started down this path was Star Trek. I watched Star Trek as a kid. It's why I'm an astronomer. And I think in retrospect is also why I'm a space ethicist. It's set in the very far future where we've already done the space settlement, but it includes the word the frontier right in the description of the show, and it leans into this idea of what is it like to go to new places and try to make good choices about what we're doing there. There's a lot of different episodes throughout all the various series of Star Trek, and what I always liked about Star Trek was the positive spin that it put on everything. Not that everything always worked out well, but that the characters were trying their best, and not just as individuals but as an organization. They had learned from the past, and they had rules about how to not interfere in certain ways, and I liked that approach of what if we as a species, or many species in the case of Star Trek, what if we get together and said we want to do this better? How can we regulate ourselves to make sure we're balancing these interests? So Star Trek was my big one. The Expanse is something, again, that I finally got around to reading and watching after enough podcast guests mentioned it to me. It's excellent, both in terms of labor rights is a big one, but also, as Janice said, it really explores politics in what feels like a very realistic way. The conflict between people who lived on Earth, people who live on Mars, and people who live in the belt just all feels very realistic. You can understand why each group feels the way it does, and also is affected and constrained by their particular environments, which I think is going to be a big thing in space. Is we're going to have some really interesting cultural and political evolution just because of the environment that people are living in. I also, since I wrote my book, I think I read Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, which is 2 books out of a trilogy that will never be finished, which are about space settlement, but never actually get to the part where they settle space. But it's set in a near future where climate change has really ravaged the Earth and the US in particular, and people are struggling with that, and the main character sort of creates her own religion about why we should be going out to the stars, but it does it in a really, really fascinating perspective that I enjoyed quite a bit. So I could go on, but but those are the ones I think that have influenced me in recent years the most.
Well, no, those are perfect. And thank you so much again for coming on the podcast. We might have to have you back for that first contact episode as well.
Sounds
But
good.
I hope that all of our listeners enjoy this as much as we did.
Thank you so much for having me.